Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into the volatile and honestly absolutely fascinating history of Persian mercenaries in the Fatimid Empire. We're going to explore how a band of captured soldiers maneuvered their way up to become the most feared, elite, and deeply influential troops in medieval Cairo, only to suffer a truly spectacular fall from grace. So, to set the stage for this massive military shakeup, we have to rewind to the late 10th century. In 969 AD, the Fatimid Caliphate conquered Egypt and officially moved their capital to Cairo. Now, this wasn't just a simple land grab. This was a highly deliberate move to build a commercial and doctrinal superpower that could rival Abbasid Baghdad. But as you can imagine, holding a new center of the world requires a genuinely spectacular military force. Right, so to really understand this era, we've got to talk about the Daylamites. Originating from the mountainous region of Daylam, these were fiercely skilled Persian troops. And while Persians had technically been present in Egypt's military in earlier decades, the Fatimids were about to use them in a completely unprecedented way, weaving them directly into the very fabric of their imperial guard. Now, you'll also hear the term al-Musharaka quite a bit, which translates to the Easterners. As the Fatimid army evolved, they grouped these newly arrived Persian troops together with Turkish soldiers. So whenever historical records mention the power of the Easterners in Cairo, they're talking about this combined, highly lethal faction. Section 1. The Rise of the Daylamites, from captives to elite guards. Okay, so while Persians were actually present in Egypt way earlier, like the tens of thousands brought over back in 883, the real turning point didn't happen until decades after the Fatimids conquered the region. The true catalyst? That was the Battle of Al-Tawahin in Palestine in 978. This single battle changed literally everything. Here's what happened. At Al-Tawahin, Imam al-Aziz pulled off a massive victory against a Turkish commander. But instead of executing his defeated enemies, which, was pretty standard practice at the time, he actually recognized their immense martial value. He brought these captive Persian and Turkish troops all the way back to Cairo and recruited them, transforming them into a favored elite unit bound directly to him. And these newly recruited troops, they didn't just get stuffed into some standard barracks, they literally reshaped the geography of Cairo. The Persians established their own quarter, Harat al-Dailam, which was prime real estate right next to the Fatimid Palace and the Al-Azhar Mosque. Meanwhile, their Turkish counterparts settled into their own neighboring quarter. As their influence absolutely exploded, those neighborhood boundaries just kind of blurred into one unified Turks and Dailam's quarter. I mean, their proximity to power was so absolute, it was actually cemented into the palace architecture. One of the main gates of the Fatimid Palace was officially named Bab al-Dailam, the Dailam Gate, and it opened directly into their heavily guarded territory. Moving on to Section 2. Naphtha, archers, and gold, the Daylamite loadout and spectacle. So what exactly made these Daylamite troops so terrifyingly valuable on the battlefield? Well, they definitely weren't your average foot soldiers. They brought highly specialized shock tactics to the table. Besides being legendary archers, they also served as the al-Nafatun, the naphtha throwers. They operated essentially as medieval flamethrowers, hurling these incredibly volatile burning incendiaries at their enemies. Couple that with their role as close proximity palace guards, and you've got the state's most devastating multi-tool. To put their elite status into perspective, at their absolute zenith under Imam al-Mustansir, the entire Fatimid army was the sprawling force of roughly 215,000 troops. But within that massive military machine, the Easterners, this al-Musharika force we've been talking about, numbered just 10,000. That is a highly concentrated, incredibly lethal fraction that held disproportionate sway over the entire empire. And they definitely made sure everyone knew their status. The Persian traveler Nasser Khusra actually visited Cairo in the mid-11th century, and he paints this incredibly vivid picture of their prestige. He watched a festival where hundreds of Daylami infantry soldiers marched ahead of the imam. They were decked out in these special, wide-sleeved golden clothes with ties around their waists, proudly brandishing their bows and arrows. They were essentially the walking, breathing symbol of imperial wealth. Which brings us to Section 3, Factions and Fierce Rivalries, a Divided Army. But, as you can probably guess, all this immense, highly visible power, it inevitably bred jealousy. The Fatimid army basically turned into a heavily armed powder keg. You had the Maghribis, they were the original North African forces holding the early power. Then you had our rising stars, the Easterners. And on top of that, there was a massive influx of Sudanese troops who were strongly backed by Imam al-Mustansir's own mother. It's wild to see how these power dynamics completely flipped an official state policy. For instance, under Imam al-Hakim, the old guard Maghrebi forces found their power heavily restricted. But the Daylamites, they were granted Aman, which meant official promises of security even during this really dark era of political assassinations. The state was actively choosing to protect these Eastern mercenaries over their original loyalists. So, this begs the question, with all this vast wealth, highly specialized weaponry, and deep political favor protecting them, how in the world did an elite force of 10,000 Easterners suddenly lose their iron grip on Cairo? Let's find out in Section 4, The Armenian Takeover, the Great Crisis. The answer really lies in a brutal internal collapse that changed Fatimid history forever. Between 1065 and 1073, Egypt was just devastated by al-Shidda al-Uzma, the Great Crisis. Amidst catastrophic famine and economic ruin, the rivalry between the Easterners and the Sudans erupted into all-out bloody street warfare. With the state completely paralyzed, a radical, outside military intervention became absolutely unavoidable. And that intervention arrived in 1073 in the form of an Armenian commander named Badr al-Din al-Jamali. He was appointed as military vizier to restore order, and, well, his methods were brutally effective. He didn't just calm the fighting down, he systematically crushed both the Sudans and the Mashari-Ka. The once mighty Daylamites found themselves entirely restricted and replaced, at the top by al-Jamali's own loyal Armenian regiments. The fall from grace was absolute. While remnants of the Persian regiments did manage to survive into the later periods of the Fatimid Empire, their days of wielding deadly nafta and dominating palace politics, those were long over. Later historical sources describe them as being relegated to purely ceremonial roles in state festivals. They literally devolved from the terrifying golden-clad vanguard of the empire to, well, simply marching in parades. Just shadows of their former glory. The story of the Daylamites is a brilliant case study in the double-edged sword of military outsourcing. I mean, they built the Fatimid state's power, they physically reshaped the very streets of its capital, and then ultimately helped burn it down in factional warfare. It leaves us with a really provocative thought. Does relying on elite foreign mercenaries inevitably sow the seeds of an empire's own internal destruction? Definitely something to think about until our next explainer.